My name is Philippe Christ. I'm Advisor for Innovation and Foresight at the International Transport Forum of the OECD. Today I'll talk a bit about some insights that we're getting from looking at the way in which mobility services are being deployed in our city streets and some of the policy implications of that. Mobility in the city has not always been straightforward, but it has been relatively easy. We've seen a few modes that we've had to manage across our city space. That is changing as we see a number of new mobility modes and new ways of interacting with transport systems in our cities, and new forms of transport, including micromobility, shared ride services, pre-booked and platform-based ride services. All of these are enabled in our cities by an infusion of digitalization in our lives and in our daily practices. This is just one element that is taking place in city space and in transport. At the same time, looking forward, we can see that many of those modes will probably be automated, highly automated, and eventually autonomous. Those will have strong implications for the way in which we use transport in our cities and the way in which transport forms our cities. But perhaps even more fundamentally, looking forward, when we start thinking about how machines start thinking for themselves with artificial intelligence, with machine learning, that will also change the way in which transport development takes place in our urban areas and the way in which our behavior in transport systems and in our cities will change. All of this is converging in transport, in cities, but greater than that in our society. And this convergence has led to a number of policy implications when we look forward to the way in which we deploy transport services and think about public authorities' actions in this space. One of the key things that we've looked at in our work in shared mobility in the past is what are going to be some of the physical impacts on our cities from a shift to more and more potentially ride services versus individual car use. This is one outcome. It seems to be one outcome that is favored by certain commercial actors. And for that reason, though, ITF has been looking at this in detail with various models. And one of the implications coming out of that work is that we need to start thinking about respacing our cities away from a parking city to a pickup and drop-off city. That is, the value that we get from the transport system, from individual transport system and public transport, is no longer from where vehicles stop and stay and where they're stored, but from how many times they can actually access the curb, pick up and drop off both people and goods. That space, that curb space, that thin strip of concrete is going to be one of the areas where policy will have to focus in the years to come. And this is why we've looked at this particular case in our work, in our report, The Shared Use City, Managing the Curb. The curb space is a complicated space. Here in Barcelona, you can see multiple uses: storage for two-wheeled motorized vehicles, a track for bicycles, a separation space between cars that are parked and those bicycles. In the back, you see a shared bike station, but also rubbish collection, a parked car, and an illegally double-parked van. This space is complex, and with the arrival of new services, it's rendered even more complex. One of the key things that we see in certain core parts of our cities today, at certain key times, is that the pressure to access the curb, especially by ride services, is such that pickup and drop-off takes place in the first or second lane of traffic. This is both dangerous and causes micro-congestion. But these services can also block other types of infrastructure, in this case, a bike path, keeping the city from being able to achieve some of their objectives in terms of active mobility. So this is all taking place at the curb. And I think one of the things that we've seen from our work is that we have to start rethinking the curb not as a static space, but as a flexible, dynamic, and eventually self-adjusting space. And we have thought of the curb as quite a static space. We've thought of it principally as a place to store vehicles in most of our cities. Store vehicles for free or store vehicles for a cost. That can change, and we see from our work that there are models going forward that can help us think about changing that. You can imagine a city as it goes from nighttime use of that curb for goods delivery, for some taxi and TNC ride service delivery, and for other uses that start coming up in the morning. New forms of public transport, traditional forms of public transport, high demand for that space for the mass movement of people, but also still some residual goods transport as well, and some services, commercial services. As the day goes on, that changes again with more commercial services like food stores, markets, etc., ride services that may be better able to deliver some of the diffuse demand at those times of day, but of course still public transport, maybe even automated public transport. And as night comes, you see again a shift towards a more service use of that space and a more diffuse use of the curb access, not just by public transport, but also by ride services. So this flexible use of space is something that is possible, and we can see the premises of this in certain instances. But it's not easy to deliver today because the way in which we organize the curb is very much analog. We organize it with signs, what is allowed, what isn't allowed, the times at which you can store a vehicle, the times at which it is illegal to store your vehicle. And even when we try to think about making more sense or more readable these rules, we still fall short from having a system that can be integrated directly into the back office and directly into the apps that are guiding a lot of our mobility choices in cities. What's required is a rethink of the way in which we actually think about that and actually monitor curb use. We have to think about coding the curb in a way where all the uses become evident, both in machine readable and also in human readable format. One of the ways to do that is, of course, inventory those uses and create a common language. But that language requires a syntax. And that's why at the ITF we've been following developments in this space and believe that some of the developments, like here, the shared streets syntax for actually exactly positioning different types of services in space are helpful. In this case, you can see the pick-up and drop-off activities of taxis, of ride services in Washington, D.C. being delivered by the operators in a common base map that doesn't allow them to reveal any of their commercially sensitive information, but allows the city to actually monitor the number of pickups and drop-offs in that space and monitor pressure on the curb. That language is one that is developing. The shared streets framework is one way of thinking about that. But going forward with the digitalization of the curb and the common referencing language, common referencing format, we start to be entering into the space where we can think about how to dynamically manage this space. Ultimately, we need to move towards a general mobility feed specification that operators in this space, public transport operators, ride service operators, new forms of shared bike services, but also freight delivery, can all convey information about where they want to go, when they're wanting to go there, and that then in turn allows the city to automatically put in place rules to manage those flows. That is something that does not yet exist, although some cities are starting to put this into place, the city of Los Angeles being one example. We also have to think about making room for all of those uses at the curb, for public transport, for freight delivery, for ride services, and make sure that those uses align with strategic priorities. Now, one place where this is taking place already is at airports, because the pressure is quite high at certain times of day, and we can see new models for allocating that space at a number of airports around the world. But in cities as well, we see that cities are starting to think about how to repurpose parking space into pick-up and drop-off zones. How that looks for a city, what type of pickup and drop-off density do you need for a city? What type of configurations for those pickup and drop-off zones are things that we've looked at in this report. And we did this not because it's science fiction, but because we already see cities like Washington, D.C., Fort Lauderdale, and Florida actively doing this in their cities, removing parking and putting in place pickup and drop-off zones where they feel those are necessary. We also have to make room for new uses and new users when, again, this aligns with policy objectives. And most cities in the world have seen a number of new uses pop up, not just dockless bike share, but micro scooter share, and who knows what will come next. All of this takes place partly at the curb, and cities will have to have a way to both digitally and in analog develop new rules for where those vehicles are allowed to go, where those vehicles are allowed to be stored. And that is something as well that this coding of the curb and the coding of urban space in general allows cities to deliver on. One final thing that cities must anticipate is that when we start to move away from a parking city to a pickup and drop-off city, there will be revenue impacts, partly because one of the only ways in which cities can manage traffic without pricing kilometers traveled on the road is by pricing parking. And if vehicles are parking less and less, that's less revenue for the city, of course, but it's also less management or less control by the city of how demand in the city for road space and parking space is evolving. So we have to think about what is the model that allows cities to manage city space, street space, and curb space when parking is no longer the right pricing tool or the correct or adapted pricing tool. One way to think about that is to think about how we can put in place a curb interaction fee, a curb kiss fee, if you will, that allows cities to variably price the access cost to gain the curb and how that might change over the course of the day and in different regions and parts of the city, and to deliver that information in a way that users, both on the freight and passenger side, can integrate directly into their back office systems. Finally, what we see generally in this space is that a lot of the decisions that will deliver new forms of transport demand and new forms of travel behavior in cities are being predicated by automatic decision-making systems, by algorithms, if you will. And one of the key messages coming out of this report, and one of the key focuses of our work in the next year, is to look at how that gap between how code is making decisions that allows people to behave in new ways, and the way in which cities and public authorities manage those decisions, manage that behavior, is widening. Code, automated decision-making systems on the one hand, paper law, human readable regulations on the other hand. And that gap, as I said, is widening, but that widening gap is also causing a lot of tension. So one of the things that we recommend from this report is that governments start thinking about algorithmic law, algorithmic regulatory interventions that allow them to close that gap, to close the interpretation of the law and allow it to more align directly with what cities and public authorities would like to see. So all of those are some of the lessons that we see coming out of this work. What happens when we move from a parking city to a pickup and drop-off city? How we can better and more flexibly, dynamically manage that space. The necessary elements that will be required for that. Having a coded digital representation of the curb. Having a language with which we can describe curb use. And thinking about the way in which governments can start, where it makes sense, making law directly in code, in computer code. Those are some of the main findings, and this is part of the work that we've done at the International Transport Forum in this rapidly evolving space. Thank you very much.